All right. What time is it? Let's begin. It's a couple of minutes after the hour, so let's start it up. So we're going to discuss four different topics. Number one, the inflation threat seems to be receding, at least for now. Then we are going to raise the question. It seems like we're back to war, but are we really? So we're going to dig into that topic. Um, and then we're going to ask the question, is Trump right to fear his support base? And finally, continuing on the topic, which we've been discussing for some time, the Democrats continue to drift increasingly in a radical direction. So those are the topics. Let's dig right into it and jump into the inflation outlook. So we had two important inflation releases. Both yesterday, we had the consumer price index, and today, the producer price index. Both were surprisingly low. So, good news on the inflation front for the month of June. So, just to really go over yesterday's numbers because that was really the more important of the two reports. The consumer price index, if you look at core inflation, which is what the Fed really focuses on and economists focus on, the month on month rate of inflation was zero. That is, compared to May, uh, June core prices did not go up at all. The expectation was that prices would rise by 0.21% on a month-on-month basis. That is June compared to May. And if you look at the year-over-year rate, that is over the last 12 months, June of 2026, going back compared to June of 2025, prices rose by, on the core reading, 2.6%, compared to 2.8% expected. So that's considerably better than expected. And I'm only going to focus on core because that's really what the Fed cares about and what most in the market care about. Now, if you look at the details are really important. If you look at the details, core goods services were down by 0.09% in June compared to May. That is the second consecutive month where goods declined in price. So that is a very, very positive development on the inflation side. Now, the area that most economists have been very concerned about is what's known as services. And if you strip out housing and you just focused on services, things like just a haircut is a service. If you go to the doctor's office, that's a service, or you go to the dentist, that's a service. Well, services, that inflationary component has been high and very sticky. But in June, we actually saw services, the prices decline compared to May. They declined by 0.2%. And that is the first time we've seen a negative print on core services since the COVID lockdown. So that is a very, very important development. And then today, we had producer prices, and I won't go into the details there, but it confirmed the disinflationary forces that we saw in yesterday's consumer price release. So, producer prices, by the way, are the prices of goods and services that businesses pay. Okay, so it's not what the consumer pays, it's not what you and I pay, but it's what businesses pay. And if businesses are seeing disinflation, then they will in turn not need to charge as much to consumers when they sell their goods. So these are two good inflation reports in a row. You're not getting such a fantastic response in in the stock market. Ordinarily, you would probably see the stock market really boom after this type of inflationary surprise. But because of all the uncertainty with the war, and of course, we have earnings coming out over the next couple of weeks. There's a lot of uncertainty about earnings. Earnings estimates are already super optimistic, especially earnings estimates regarding tech companies. So there's a lot of nervousness that maybe companies aren't going to meet earnings expectations. So for those two reasons, the war and the upcoming earnings releases, you have investors being very skittish, and therefore these really much better than expected inflation numbers are not having the positive impact on markets that they ordinarily would. But nevertheless, it's very good news. Now, I want to put it into context because in the last couple of days, and I'm not going to address Kevin Warsh's comments. He spoke yesterday. He's speaking again today. It's basically a copy paste. What he said today is the same thing he said yesterday. He's not adding any new real insights to what he said in the past. But two important speakers have addressed markets in the last couple of days, and they are Chris Waller and John Williams, and they're two very important Fed members. And I want to review what they have said about inflation because it's very telling and it puts the latest data in perspective. Now, they spoke before these inflation numbers were released. So Chris Waller, when he spoke a couple days ago, and he spoke actually on Tuesday morning. Okay, he spoke on Tuesday morning. And again, he spoke, I said Tuesday morning. He spoke on Monday afternoon. Spoke on Monday afternoon. The inflation numbers came out on Tuesday morning. The CPI came out on Tuesday morning. So it was before the numbers were officially released to the marketplace. Now, in his remarks, he said that inflation has become a problem. And remember, if we go back to Chris Waller, a few months ago, he was not so concerned about inflation. He thought it would be rolling over. And now he is saying that inflation is a problem. It's stickier than he and his fellow Fed members thought it would be. The impact of tariffs has lasted a bit longer. So that's one factor that has surprised him. A second factor that surprised him is something that surprised most economists was the onset of the war and then the spike in oil prices and the threat that higher oil prices present to inflation going forward. So that's a second concern that he has. And finally, he talked about services, which I mentioned earlier. Services came down in June for the first time since the lockdown of 2020. But he really raised a lot of concern about those sticky and high service prices. He says inflation is a problem. I didn't think it would be, but it's much more of a problem than I thought it would be. Second, he says that both our economy and the labor market are in pretty good shape. And he's implying there that, you know what, if we need to raise interest rates, I'm not so worried that hike in interest rates is going to cause a dramatic economic slowdown and cause a significant increase in the unemployment rate. So we sort of have a green light to raise interest rates. If it were the case that we had a fragile economy and we needed to raise interest rates, but raising interest rates could tip the economy over into a recession, then I'd be reluctant to raise interest rates. But I'm not concerned about that. We have a strong economy, a strong labor market. So if we need to raise interest rates, it's not a problem. Okay, so that was his second big point. Then his third point is that, look, I'm not saying that we definitely have to raise interest rates. But if we do not see inflation coming down soon, And he didn't define what he meant by soon, but we can assume what he meant is either this month or next month. So either in, the numbers that we are getting, that we got over the last 2 days, and the numbers that we'll get next month, if we don't see a real deceleration, like ASAP, we're going to have to raise interest rates. Okay, so that was his third point. Um, now, the the question I have, okay, he gave these remarks again. I said on Monday afternoon. Um, Inflation came out Tuesday morning. Did he already have those inflation numbers in hand? And it's very possible that he did. It's very possible that he did. And he was just sending a very hawkish message to the market, knowing that we were about to receive pretty good news. So why would he do that? Why would he do that? Because that's a way of strengthening the Fed's credibility with words, with rhetoric, without having to take policy action, without having to raise interest rates. Okay, it's a freebie for him, right? He's going to talk super tough. We're going to do it. We're going to do it, and we better get good inflation numbers like right now. And if we don't, we're going to deliver on interest rate hikes. And the market says, "Oh wow, this guy's serious. The Fed is serious. They are going to raise rates." And this is a great way of boosting the Fed's credibility, and then they don't even have to take policy action. Now, why do I think he might have had the data already? Because the Fed does get the data the day before we get the data. Now, the question is, at what time did he get that data? Did he get the data? So he definitely had the data on Monday. Did he get it after he gave the speech or before he gave the speech? I don't know. There's no way for us to know exactly at what time he got that data. But in any case, he did take a step forward, I think, in building the Fed's credibility. Now, John Williams, another very important. I mean, outside of Kevin Warsh, Chris Waller and John Williams are the two most important members of the Fed. Okay, they're the ones who carry the greatest weight when there's a big debate going on, around, around the Fed table when they're having discussions at their meetings. So, what did John Williams say? He didn't speak on Monday. He actually spoke last Friday. And what he said is that my big takeaway from his speech came in one line. He said that for the Fed to leave rates unchanged, that is for us at the Fed not to raise interest rates, we need to see month on month core inflation averaging about 0.2% or less. Okay, so yesterday's number, again, we're talking about a CPI, it came in at 0%. So it came in well below his 0.2%. And the market, by the way, was expecting 0.21%. So that rounds to 0.2%. So even if the number came in right in line with the consensus forecast, that would have been good enough for John Williams for the Fed to hold off on any interest rate hike. But it came in at 0%. So with that, we can be very confident that at the Fed's next meeting, which is in a few weeks on July 29th, they are not going to raise interest rates. Now, prior to this number, the market was expecting that the Fed would raise interest rates. Okay, that in all likelihood, there was an interest rate coming. But this number takes that off the table. We don't have to worry about it. Okay. Now, there's still a possibility that they may go ahead and raise interest rates in September, but that will all depend on what we see in the July inflation number. But given how good these numbers were today and yesterday, the probability that we get a month-on-month number of above John Williams's 0.2%, that's pretty low. So I would say we're probably safe not only in July, but we're probably safe for September as well. No interest rate hikes. And for those of you in our currency program, the reason why I'm sort of reluctant at this point to put on a long dollar trade or a short the euro against the dollar, it's because the market was really expecting rate hikes this year and by the Fed. And if we don't get rate hikes this year by the Fed, that could lead to some, nothing dramatic, but to some modest dollar weakness. And the only reason we're seeing sort of the dollar not weakening, but kind of stable here is really the threat of war. So that's the topic we're going to jump into right now. Where are we in the war? Now, before we try to answer that question, I was listening this week to a panel of experts on Iran, on the war, and I heard a very good characterization, very good framework, I should say, of how to think about the divisions right now in the Iranian regime. Okay, because we tend to think of the Iranian government as monolithic, as unified, but it's not. The reality is that it's not, and the war, which began on February 28th, has led to some real factions opening up in in the regime. So I want to discuss those factions, and that might help give us some insight as to the direction of where things might be headed. So the first faction and the most powerful faction is known as the Boots. Now, what are the Boots? The Boots is the elite of the military establishment, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Okay, the IRGC. Now, it's not surprising that they have the most power today because they have the guns. Not only do they have the guns, but the IRGC controls something like 2/3 of the Iranian economy. Okay, so they have economic control, they have military control. And because of those two factors, it's not that they're popular in society. They're not popular, they're very unpopular, but they are feared. And fear is the key to their domestic power base. All right, they're deeply feared. The next faction, okay, and historically, this faction used to be the most powerful, but because of we're at war now, they're not the most powerful anymore. And this group is known as the turbans, right? The turbans, they're called the turbans because they all wear turbans on their heads. These are the real ideologues. They are the religious fanatics, and they're the Ayatollahs, right? And the Ayatollahs traditionally since 1979 have ruled Iran with the assistance of the Boots, with the assistance of the IRGC. But it was always the turbans on top, and they got their key support base. Their key support base came from the IRGC. Well, since the war has started, the turbans and this was happening anyway. By the way, but the war really solidified the change in the power structure. So now the turbans have the second most power. And they continue to supply the religious ideology, the revolutionary ideology for the regime, and for traditionally the popular support base. But now the turbans barely have a popular support base. Among this panel, that I listened to, there were different opinions. Some said the turbans had somewhere between, the ceiling was maybe they have 10% support in the country. Others put it as low as 3%. So anyway, the support for, let's say, the regime broadly, but the turbans specifically, is somewhere between 3% of the population and 10% of the population, with the rest of the population absolutely hating them. Okay, so this is a hated regime. Somewhere between 90 and 97% of the country probably despise this regime. So the ideology of this country, the Islamist ideology, which at one point was the greatest weapon that the regime had, is no longer a weapon, but it's actually a weapon against them, right? It's their probably one of their biggest vulnerabilities is how much the population hates this Islamist ideology that the regime embraces. But the turbans, nevertheless, are the second most powerful block or faction of the regime. But there's a pretty significant gap between the power of the boots and the power of the turbans. Then from there, the next group was called the street. Now, what is the street? The street are really the paramilitary groups that they operate on motorcycles. They intimidate the population. They're like an arm of the IRGC. Okay, I've talked about the besieged forces, right? So the street is really the besieged forces. Now their entire power derives from the IRGC. So they're nothing without the IRGC, and they are considered by this panel to be the third most powerful faction of the regime. Now, can the IRGC count on the continued support of the besieged? That's an open question because it's really the besieged. If there are protests at some point in the future and would people come out in droves like they have in the past to take to the streets, the question is, can the IRGC continue to count on the besieged to open up fire and murder protesting civilians? Okay. So far, the answer to that question has been yes. But at some point, it could switch to no. And if the answer switches to no, that's when you would have regime collapse. And then the final faction of the Iranian regime are called the suits. Now, why are they called the suits? Because they dress in nice, fancy Western suits with a tie and a jacket. They're the ones that, sometimes you'll see someone interviewed by a CNN reporter, and he looks so handsome and well put together, and he just looks like, an American or a European, dressed in a sophisticated fashion. These are the suits. And they are the ones who are actually, they've been the face to Iran, of Iran, to the world many times. Right now, they're the ones who are negotiating with the Americans, and they are probably the weakest of the factions. But there's one individual among the suits who actually does have a lot of power. Okay, and his name is Mohammed Ghalibaf. Perhaps you've heard about him in the press. I've mentioned his name before. He happens to be the chief negotiator for Iran, and he's also the Speaker of the Parliament. And when you hear J.D. Vance or Donald Trump talk about we're now at the third, we've wiped out the first level of leaders. We've wiped out the next level of leaders. And now we're negotiating with the third. Trump will say the third regime. That's an improper use of the word regime. But Trump will say we're now talking with the third regime. And they're more rational. They're more reasonable. He's really talking about Mohammed Ghalibaf. And the reason why Trump likes Ghalibaf so much and why J.D. Vance likes Ghalibaf so much, well, there's probably a range of reasons. Number one, he's probably a very good liar, and he tells these guys what they want to hear. But also, there's reason to believe, and I don't know this, no one on this panel knew this for sure, but they were reasonably confident that Ghalibaf probably has provided important intel to the Americans, to the United States, to our military. And why did Ghalibaf provide important intelligence? Well, it was a way for him to survive. In fact, maybe he told the Americans who shared that information with the Israelis where certain individuals were that we've eliminated, right? It's very possible that Galibaf gave us important information and we've used it to eliminate certain leaders. Perhaps he supplied information allowing us to know where certain military assets were being hidden. And we were able to remove those military assets because of the intel that he shared with us. Again, why would he do it? Because he's preserving his life. So when Trump or J.D. Vance or Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff see that Galibaf is providing us key intel, their assumption is this guy is totally rational. He just wants to live. This is someone we can deal with. Okay. Now that's been a terrible mistake on our side. Number one, because Galibaf is he's not the one at the end of the day calling the shots. The IRGC, they are the real power brokers. They are calling the shots, and they're just using Galibaf. Now, it's important to note that the IRGC, and not only IRGC, but the turbans, the street, they all hate Galibaf. And the reason they hate Galibaf is because they're suspicious of him. Maybe they don't know for sure that he's provided intel to the United States and to Israel, but for sure they're suspicious of him. They're suspicious of him. But they don't kill him, they don't jail him because they know he has been a very important interlocutor with the United States, right? This negotiator, he's getting things from the United States. He's getting the United States to make certain concessions, right? Because of his negotiating abilities. Okay, Iran was able to sell, at least for a few weeks, their oil on international markets, and they made somewhere between $4 and $5 billion because of Galibaf's negotiating skills. So they need him alive, but they hate him. Okay, so this gives us a sense a lot of the factions that are going on inside Iran, the hatred that some groups have for the other, the shifts in power structure. Right, the turbans used to be on top, but now the IRGC is on top. I'm sure there's some intense rivalry between those two groups now. The IRGC doesn't know if they can necessarily count on the street, that is the besieged, the paramilitary forces. If push comes to shove, will the besieged actually open up fire on protesters? So we have real reasons to believe that there are serious divisions going on inside the Iranian regime. So this is interesting, and perhaps the regime is a lot more fragile than this monolithic idea that many of us have of the regime. Now, the question is, as we go towards now assessing where we stand in terms of the status of the war, the Iranians could have gone all in with the memorandum of understanding, right? That is this agreement, this ceasefire with the United States, which was going to be in place for 60 days. And it could have been extended for an additional 60 days. That if the IRGC wanted to continue with this arrangement, they could have. And they had a lot to gain from it, right? The Strait of Hormuz would have remained open. They could have continued to sell their oil exports and made billions. I mentioned they made 4 or 5 billion, but they could have made tens of billions had they just continued to play the game and allowed the negotiations to continue. Okay? But they didn't. They didn't. And the reason they didn't is because this regime ultimately, even the IRGC, is absolutely driven by ideology. Okay? They have this, it's known as 12er Shiism, right? They have this ideology that they will bring back the 12th Imam who is in hiding, this guy who disappeared, in the 900s CE. Okay, so he's been disappeared for over 1,000 years. He's in hiding, but he's alive, and they have this apocalyptic vision that if the world tumbles towards a massive, massive war, their imam, who's like a messiah, will return and he will bring Islam to the entire world. This regime truly, truly believes these ideas, right? It's hard for J.D. Vance to understand this. It's hard for Donald Trump to believe this, but they have no problem jumping back into war. Okay. And in fact, submitting to the United States and uh, honoring an agreement which they believe ultimately might hurt them from an ideological standpoint, that actually pushes back the time from when this imam, this messianic figure, will return to the world. So bringing chaos, bringing war, ties in with their apocalyptic vision of the world. Okay. Again, very hard for J.D. Vance and Donald Trump to understand these things, but it's real. Now, at the same time, I'm not suggesting that Iran wants to return at this moment to an all-out war. Why is that? Why wouldn't they want to return to an all-out war? But first of all, how do we know they don't want to return to an all-out war? If they wanted all-out war today, they wouldn't just be firing at U.S. military bases in the Persian Gulf, at countries like Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait, right? That they're firing missiles at those countries, at U.S. Gulf allies, but they're not firing at Israel. Why aren't they firing at Israel? Because they are not ready at this moment to go back to all-out war. They know what will Israel do if Israel gets fired on. They're going to take out all these leaders, right? The intelligence the intel, the precision strikes that Israel has been able to do, the Iranians understand it, and they know that they will be wiped out. So they're not ready for that. What they prefer is this low-level war with the United States, which we're getting. It will put, as it's doing, put upward pressure on oil prices and put Trump in a position where the Republican Party is likely to lose midterm elections. That's really the game that they're playing right now. Okay. So J.D. Vance, he was given the opportunity, right? The whole MOU was his baby, right? It was he and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They were the three, and there were others as well, but those are the main proponents of reaching an agreement with Iran. And they flew to meet with Ghalibaf and Ghalibaf's team, and they negotiated. And J.D. Vance came back from those negotiations. And what did he tell us? He told us that it was absolutely amazing that he and Witkoff and Kushner were able to meet face to face with the Iranians, right? And he came back and he told us, look, these are normal, rational people. And Vance and his team of negotiators, it's clear that they completely misjudged the IRGC. Why? Because Vance doesn't understand the ideology of 12er Shiism, right? He doesn't understand when these guys say they want to take over the world and they want to wipe every Jew and Christian off the face of the world. He doesn't understand that they actually mean it. This isn't just like empty speech. It's real. They mean it. You can't negotiate with people who are deeply, deeply, radically driven by ideology. Okay? Vance, Kushner, and Witkoff, they really believe, look, if we just give them economic opportunity, if we just give them enough money, they will become moderate. They will become people that we can deal with and negotiate with, right? We can have common sense talks and come with a common understanding. We'll make a sacrifice. They'll make a sacrifice. We'll meet somewhere in the middle and we'll all live happily ever after. And the Middle East will be a nice, calm, rational place. No, that's not the game the Iranian regime plays. It's not the game the IRGC plays. Okay. And what happened? It seems like in recent days, President Trump has sort of seen the light and he's backed off of embracing this view that these are rational, nice people, right? He sort of abandoned the J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff vision of what they think the Iranian regime is. And now Trump is saying they meaning the Iranians, violate the agreement every day, right? These are Trump's words. He says they lie, they cheat, they kill people. These are quotes right out of Donald Trump's own mouth. And remember, Vance had insisted that the regime was operating in good faith and was representing, the best interests of the Iranian people, the best interests of the United States. And I'm going to quote J.D. Vance. This is a quote right out of his mouth. They want to have a much brighter future. Okay. That's what he thought. They want to have a much brighter future. And he said that Israel needs to stop trying to solve every diplomatic spat with guns, right? The naivete of J.D. Vance. Some people have argued, no, J.D. Vance is perhaps he's just playing a role. Trump wants him to negotiate, and he's going out and playing that role. Maybe, but he's playing that role because these are ideas that J.D. Vance truly embraces. He made these types of comments before the war. He made these types of comments, you know, many, many times way before this war started. He made these types of comments even before the 12-day war started last year. These ideas that the Iranian people are rational, they just want prosperity like everyone else in the world. He just simply doesn't get it. These are genuinely his ideas. But now again, Trump seems to having a deeper understanding of what's going on. But the question is, again, and I'm digging into all this because we want to know, where is this war going? Where is this war going? Does Trump truly get it? Does he really understand that he's dealing with real evil? Well, just yesterday, an unnamed member of the Trump administration said, we are going to, I'm quoting, we are going to slap them around for a little while and see what happens. Okay. So again, this is someone from the administration. This person isn't speaking for Trump himself, but that sounds like the Trump administration still believes if we hit them hard enough, we can bring them back to the negotiating table and get them to be reasonable negotiators. And we can settle on something that everyone can live with. That's what that language sounds like. But what about Trump? Trump sounds like he gets it now, right? He's calling these people crazy, right? Unreasonable. But then just yesterday, Trump said the U.S. could return to the negotiating table, right? He said it just yesterday. So this implies that Trump himself still believes that he can get these radical ideological barbarians to change their minds, to change their behavior, right? And Trump's own words still seem to reflect still a profound misunderstanding of who these people actually are. The reality is the leadership in Iran needs to be eliminated. And this regime, it's not like, okay, we're gonna take off the third level of leaders. So we'll get to the fourth, and the fourth level, we're gonna find someone who's reasonable. We're gonna find a Delcy Rodriguez, right? That's the current Venezuelan leader who replaced Nicolas Maduro, right? Trump now believes that Delcy Rodriguez is his pawn. Trump believes he can find the Delcy Rodriguez inside of the Iranian regime that is incorrect thinking. Okay. You're not going to find one individual who can be a game changer, right? The regime is completely evil. They're completely ideological. One person cannot change the entire regime. Okay. The regime needs to be toppled. That is the only way to get this regime to be reasonable. You need a new regime, new leadership that the people choose. So for now, what does it seem like the US strategy? What are we doing? For now, the US military seems to be solely focused on opening up the Strait of Hormuz for international shipping, right? Because Iran keeps attacking ships that are passing through the Strait of Hormuz that interferes with transport of goods and services out of the Middle East and Persian Gulf uh, to Europe and throughout the rest of the world. Most importantly, oil, right? We want oil ships to be able to travel in and out, and that will permanently bring down the price of oil. These are important objectives that Trump has at the top of his mind. So the fighting we're doing right now is all about liberating the Strait of Hormuz to prevent Israel from no longer being able to file missiles and drones at international shipping. That's what's going on. And Iran is trying to prevent the US from opening up the Strait of Hormuz, right? That's what this fight is all about at the moment. It's not about trying to topple the Iranian regime. It's all about the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the question is, how will we know when Trump truly gets it? Okay. How will we know? At some point, you would think he'll say enough is enough. Well, before we answer that, he has openly threatened, right? Just yesterday, he openly threatened starting next week, if these guys don't come to the negotiating table and make a deal with us. When he says make a deal, he means surrender all their nuclear capabilities, right? Surrender their ability to enrich uranium, surrender the dust, as he likes to call it. Give us what we want. If you don't make a deal with us, we're going to start attacking key infrastructure. We're going to take out major roads. We're going to take out major bridges. Then we're going to take out your oil infrastructure. Okay, step by step, beginning next week, this is what's coming. Now, that's good. But in the past, every time Trump has made these big, bold, frightening threats, the next thing out of his mouth is they're begging for a deal. We're returning to the negotiating table because we got a promise they're going to give us a deal. They are surrendering. They're giving us everything we want, right? That's the Iranian way, right? Trump makes the big threat. Iran makes the phone call to the president. They say, okay, we're going to give you what you want. Let's meet in Pakistan. Let's meet in Switzerland. And let's start talking, and we're ready to give you what you want. Let's sign. And then they start the delay tactics again. And then they start to backpedal from the promises that they made to Trump over the phone, right? This game has been played again and again. So when will we know that Trump truly gets it? I'll tell you when. When he calls the Israelis in. When he picks up the phone and he says, Bibi, let's go. It's time to start taking out the leaders. That's when we know that Trump has said enough is enough. We're done with this nonsense. So next week is going to be key, right? And the reason why financial markets are uncertain, right? They're not so worried about all-out war breaking out. Their concern is that the Strait of Hormuz is still being disrupted. Oil prices have been pressured upwards again, right? And the Iranians are trying to block oil from getting out. The United States is not allowing Iran to export their oil anymore to China and whoever else wants to buy it, because remember, the U.S. removed all sanctions. The sanctions are back on, but they removed all sanctions on Iranian oil exports. So that also helped bring down oil prices. But now those sanctions are back on, oil prices are being pressured higher, and that's why one of the major reasons why um, financial markets are under a bit of stress and volatility over the last few days. It's not so much that people are panicking about all-out war breaking out. And I'm sure if all-out war does break out and Israel enters the game, the markets aren't going to like that very much. But markets don't think that's where we're headed right now. If markets really thought that's where we were headed, we would see, and Israel was entering the war back, you'd see a much more substantial drop in the market. But the quicker this turns into all-out war, the quicker it ends, right? I would say that we probably have somewhere between, if we see a return to all-out war, that all-out war would last 2 to 3 weeks. You'd get the leadership devastated. You'd get more military targets taken out. Iran's oil infrastructure and other infrastructure would be completely blown up. And then it would be time for the population to rise up. Um, and I would say we'd have 2 to 3 weeks of financial market chaos, but then we'd see an all clear signal. Okay, so that's where we are in the war. I want to answer the question now. Go to the question: is Trump right to be so worried about the midterms? A lot of this hesitation by Trump, and why did he stop on April 8th? Why did he stop on April 8th? He stopped on April 8th because he was really concerned about the midterms, mostly, right? There are probably some other factors as well, but 80% of it was midterm elections. And his generals were telling him, look, this is going to take us 2 to 3 more weeks. Oil prices could go even higher. That will cause, and then his economists told him, look, if oil prices go even higher, that's going to cause more inflation, more economic damage. And higher inflation, obviously, is going to cause problems for you in the midterms. So was Trump right to be concerned about the midterm elections and, the war just being unpopular among the MAGA base, right? Because that's what we continue to hear among the MAGA base, especially among younger voters. This war is deeply, deeply unpopular. But is that accurate? So in the last 2 weeks, I've been citing a lot of polls. A lot of these polls are coming from the Reagan Institute. They released more polling data. And I found these latest polls very interesting. So this set of polls deals with Generation Z MAGA voters. So that is people under the age of 30 who call themselves MAGA. And these questions that they ask are focused on foreign policy. Okay. So I'm just going to give you some of the results of these polls. And again, is Trump right to be so concerned that young MAGA voters are wildly against the war? And if you look at social media, that's my impression, right? My impression is from being on X, young MAGA voters are so against this war. They're so against Israel. Tucker Carlson is onto something. He's identifying a real shift in the mood among younger people, and that's what Megyn Kelly is gravitating towards, Tucker Carlson. But what does the data say? So the data says from the Reagan Institute polling, 72% of MAGA voters under the age of 30 believe that the United States should be more engaged and should take the lead on foreign policy, while just 19% say the U.S. should be less engaged in foreign affairs. Okay. So that's a 53 percentage point spread between those who believe, young voters who believe that the US should take on a global leadership role, right? So quite the opposite of what you would think. Next question. Next, 74% of people under the MAGA voters under the age of 30. I'm going to stop saying MAGA voters under the age of 30, okay, because it'll get repetitive. So 74% agree that the US has a moral obligation to stand up for human rights and democracy whenever possible throughout the world. 73% say that Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury was the correct decision. Okay. 73% are on board with it. Okay. So under 30% think it was the wrong decision. Operation Epic Fury is the war against Iran that started on February 28th. Okay. So that's overwhelming support. I'm not saying, 27% didn't approve, or it's actually less than 20%. It's like 15% didn't approve. The rest are unsure. So 15% is not nothing, but overwhelmingly they supported the war. 59% support the Iranian people in their efforts to secure freedom and democracy. 59%. Just 13% say we shouldn't be supporting the Iranian people. Just 13%. The rest are unsure. So 59% against 13%. That is overwhelming. 61% want to see this Iranian regime either removed or severely weakened. 61% versus 35%, okay, who want a negotiated settlement. So 35% is still a lot. But again, if you're President Trump, are you going to cater to the 61% or 35%? You should be catering to the 61%. It's an overwhelming disparity. Now, how does that rank, by the way, compared to those who favored the removal of Nicolas Maduro from power in Venezuela, which was an incredibly successful operation, right? That 64% were on board with that, right? 64% on board. So 61% want to see the Iranian regime removed, like today, where 64% say they agreed with removing Nicolas Maduro. And that we know with hindsight, that was a success. So the matchup is very similar. That's interesting. Just some other topics. 60% would support Trump using military force to remove the Cuban government from power. So this idea that the young MAGA base is isolationist and doesn't want to use military force, it's false, right? The majority of young MAGA voters like the idea of using the military if we believe we can be successful. Okay. 60% approve of sending U.S. weapons to Israel. 13% oppose. Say you have a lot of people who are uncertain, but again, 60 versus 13, overwhelming support for supporting weapons to Israel. Okay, there's a bunch of more questions I could go through, but you get the point, right? You get the point. And the bottom line for me here is, when J.D. Vance and others have been telling the president you're losing young MAGA voters, that is improper advice. They are not looking at the data. They're so glued to their social media, and the loudest, you tend to think that the loudest is right, right? I think we're all guilty of that. I certainly am as well. That, what's really loud represents the majority, but that's not true, right? There's a quiet majority that believes in a strong U.S. presence in the world, believes in U.S. leadership, believes that the U.S., when we think it could be effective to use our military, that we should use it, right? And people like Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, who J.D. Vance is certainly listening to, right? That's off base. That's not where MAGA is, not even where young MAGA is. Okay. I just want to take the last few minutes to speak about this uh, radicalism that continues to sweep across the Democratic Party. And the most recent example I want to point out is I don't know if you have heard of Ro Khanna. He is a congressman, a Democratic congressman from California. He recently made a trip to Israel. Anytime a U.S. politician makes a trip to Israel, they're strongly encouraged to coordinate their trip with the American embassy in Israel. So that would be, Mike Huckabee is the ambassador, the American ambassador to Israel. So what a politician, a congressman would ordinarily do is give Mike Huckabee's office a call and say, "Hey, Mike, we're headed to Israel. We wanted to let you know any suggestions for who we should meet with. We'd love, if you think we need security, if you could coordinate that for us." Ro Khanna did not contact anyone in the Israeli government. He did not contact the U.S. embassy in Israel. He went with a specific goal, and his goal was to really create some sort of international incident and to create a big stir. And that's exactly what he did. He went to a restricted military zone in an area, Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank. And he went there to a restricted military zone where civilians, certainly unannounced, should not just show up. But he showed up. He showed up on Shabbat, okay, on the Sabbath, on the Jewish Sabbath, to a very religious area, unannounced. And he showed up with New York Times photographers and reporters because his intention was to make a scene. Now, if someone shows up to this restricted area unannounced, there is going to be a response, right? Local security is going to show up to the scene. And that's exactly what happened. Local security showed up to the scene because usually when someone shows up to a restricted military zone unannounced, it's likely ordinarily someone who wants to cause trouble, could be a terrorist, usually is a terrorist. So local law enforcement shows up to the scene immediately, which is what happens, right? They showed up with guns and they called the official military, the IDF, who showed up a bit later, and they questioned Ro Khanna and the reporters. And Ro Khanna makes a huge scene out of this. And he says he was harassed and he was threatened. None of that happened, right? All of this is on video. All he was questioned like anyone would be, right? If you showed up to an unrestricted military zone in the United States, you would be questioned with armed guards, right? If you showed up to a military base unannounced, if you showed up to you name it, an unrestricted area where civilians aren't allowed, if they didn't call in advance, there'd be a response. So why did Ro Khanna do this? Well, we can only speculate. But remember, it was just a few days ago where Graham Plattner, the Democratic candidate for senator from Maine, it was revealed that he'd been, attempted or actually did rape a woman from Maine. She became public, and he ultimately had to withdraw his candidacy. But Ro Khanna, as well as many other Democrats, were openly supporting him. And Ro Khanna's reputation, there he is, Ro Khanna endorsing a rapist. He needed to take the world's attention off of his support for Graham Plattner. And what does he do? What have we been talking about? What is the litmus test? What is the purity test for anyone in the Democratic Party these days? What do? You blast Israel, right? If you want a big boost in support, you blast Israel, you start talking about genocide, you start depicting Israel as this evil regime. So that's what he does. He runs to Israel. He creates mayhem. He creates an international incident. He knew exactly what he was doing. He showed up with New York Times reporters and photographers. He created an incident. And in so doing, right, he diverts attention from his support from Graham Plattner. And here I am. See, Democrats, I'm passing the purity test with flying colors. I'm depicting Israel as this horrible, country. So this is the radicalism of the Democrats. And any stunt, they will stop at nothing, right? And they where all the country is doing is protecting their security, he turns it into an international incident where he makes it look like the Israelis are unnecessarily, brandishing their weapons. That's obviously not what was happening. But this is the radicalism of the Democratic Party. And their purity test is always to bash Israel. And as we talked about last week, this is a very, very, very dangerous moment for the Democratic Party. This is a party that is in a downward spiral and is becoming more and more radical by the day. And we see no end in sight to this. And it's a problem. It's a problem for the country. And not enough people are denouncing this and calling attention to it. And certainly no one in the Democratic Party is calling attention to this. Ro Khanna should be thrown under the bus by his own party, but that's not happening. The guy is a hero for doing what he's doing. So anyway, that sort of wraps up today's discussion. If anyone has any questions, comments on anything, fire away.